The man who left his masks in my walls. I first heard the tapping behind my bedroom wall around 3 a.m. A strange rhythmic knock, like someone politely waiting to be invited into a place they already occupied. The tapping moved slowly, shifting left, then right, then above the bed, like whoever was inside the wall was adjusting their position to get comfortable before continuing. When I pressed my ear to the plaster, I felt faint vibrations, too steady to be pipes, too intentional to be rodents, almost like someone dragging fingertips across the wood. The next morning, I found a small slit in the baseboard, thin as a knife's edge, something freshly cut, the wood curling outward like it was peeled from the inside. I shined my phone flashlight into the slit and saw something pale retreat deeper, withdrawing like a startled animal, yet shaped unmistakably like a human hand. That night the tapping returned, louder and faster, now mimicking my movements. A tap whenever I turned, a faint scrape whenever I exhaled, like something studying the rhythm of my life. I moved my dresser in front of the slit, but when I woke, it had been pushed several inches aside, the opening widened to the size of a fist. Inside the hole, I found an object. A mask carved from thin wood, shaped like a human face, but stretched vertically. Eyes too round, mouth too narrow, smile too forced. The texture felt warm, almost soft, like it had been pressed against skin, and the inside still carried faint moisture, as if someone had worn it moments before placing it here. A note was wedged behind the mask, written in jagged strokes. "This one doesn't fit you. I'll bring another." I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the walls felt amplified. The tapping, the shifting, the dragged breaths echoing faintly through wooden ribs of the house. Something scraped along the ceiling, slow and exploratory, like someone crawling above me, testing beams, testing angles, mapping out which direction I tended to move when frightened. By morning, 2 more slits appeared, one near the closet, one beneath the window, each hiding a different mask, one wide like a frog's, another narrow and angular like a fox's skull. Each mask was carved from the same strange wood, warm to the touch, with faint fingerprints pressed into the surface, as if molded by someone with inhuman precision. Another note was attached. "You don't know your face yet. Let me try again." When I tried boarding up the slits, the nails bent outward from inside the wall, metal groaning, wood bowing, as though the house itself was rejecting any attempt to seal him out. That night footsteps patrolled the crawl space above my ceiling, pacing slowly, dragging a heavy sack that made the drywall tremble slightly with each movement. A soft voice hummed through the vents, low, melodic, unsettling, matching no language I knew, yet carrying a cadence that felt ritualistic, like a lullaby meant for the unwilling. I crouched by the first slit when the tapping began again, but this time the tapping tapped back in a perfect rhythm to my breath, sinking like a heartbeat pressed against the wall. When I looked inside, 2 eyes stared back, pale, lidless, wet with reflection, watching with such patient interest I forgot how to breathe for several seconds. His fingers emerged, placing a new mask gently on the floor, shaped like a deer with elongated features, the size disturbingly perfect for my own face. The note behind it read, "Better. Try this when you're ready." I threw the mask across the room, but the moment it hit the floor, something shifted in the walls, an annoyed exhale, or disappointment, followed by heavy crawling retreating deeper. At dawn I heard rustling in the attic, then a soft thud, then dragging, like he was carrying something larger, something he wanted to show me, but wasn't sure how yet. I climbed the attic ladder slowly, bracing for anything, and saw dozens of masks arranged in a circle, each carved into uncanny expressions that resembled versions of my own face. Some looked younger, some older, some distorted as if drawn from nightmares, and every mask's eyes seemed carved to stare directly where I stood. A final note lay in the center. "I'm still working. You don't see your true face, but I do. Let me finish." The attic lights flickered, shadows stretching. and I heard him crawling rapidly toward me from behind the far wall, claws tapping with eager relief. I slammed the ladder shut and ran, but every room I passed had new slits in the walls, each with a fresh mask peeking out, waiting, watching. By nightfall, the entire house tapped in unison, walls, floor, ceiling, like a full-body heartbeat, anticipating the moment I finally put one of the masks on. I don't know what happens if I do, but he won't stop until I wear the one he made for me. The masked pairs who mirror my every move. I first noticed them when I returned home late. Two figures crouched in opposite corners of the hallway, their masks shaped like deer heads, eyes dark hollows reflecting nothing. The air smelled faintly of damp fur and cold clay, though nothing in the room explained it, and the figures didn't move as I stepped closer. I froze, realizing their positions mirrored each other perfectly, like some silent choreography designed around my arrival, each motion anticipating what I would do next. They didn't speak, didn't breathe audibly, yet I could feel their gaze pressing through the room, following each careful step I made toward the kitchen. When I moved to the living room, they rose in unison, gliding across the floor silently, keeping distance but maintaining perfect alignment, a synchronized reflection of one another. One figure crouched behind the couch, the other behind the doorway, observing with rigid patience, as though testing whether I noticed the symmetry. I tried calling out, but my voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the room, while their mirrored heads tilted faintly, as if they were studying my reaction. Every surface seemed to distort slightly when they passed, reflections bending in mirrors, windows, even the polished floor, as if reality itself yielded to their rhythm. I backed toward the hallway, and they followed, but not directly, always mirrored, always cautious, tracking me in a pattern that made my skin crawl. The masks were crude, painted with jagged lines like teeth, and their shapes elongated unnaturally when I glanced sideways, stretching into impossible angles my mind couldn't hold. I tried to leave through the door, but it creaked softly as though warning me, and I realized the animal figures anticipated my movements before I even thought to act. The kitchen lights flickered and dimmed when I entered, shadows leaning unnaturally toward the corners where the masked pair now crouched silently, perfectly mirrored against each other again. I dared a closer look, seeing their hands resting lightly on the floor, knuckles pressing against wood, as if feeling vibrations from some hidden pulse I couldn't perceive. Every object I touched seemed heavier afterward, weighed down subtly, like the air around them was thickening to shape the room according to their silent choreography. I tried moving backward to the living room, and they shifted again in perfect symmetry, like a mirrored dance, silent and deliberate, studying me in ways no human could. The hallway seemed to stretch, doors elongating slightly, shadows bending, making it impossible to measure distance, as they maintained mirrored alignment just beyond my peripheral vision. I felt their presence behind me in reflections, each mirror showing the same two figures, one on the left, one on the right, neither stepping into frame fully. When I raised my hands, both raised theirs in unison, copying my movements with slight delay, but just enough to feel deliberate, knowing, aware. A faint scraping sound came from the ceiling, above the pair, like someone shifting quietly on old beams. Another observer, or perhaps the source of the choreography. I noticed a single line of movement across the floor, where their shadows weren't supposed to exist, bending against physics, linking the mirrored figures as if reality had split to accommodate them. I whispered a question, testing them, and both slowly tilted their masked heads, the jagged lines of the paint rippling faintly like smiles, though they never spoke. I moved toward the bedroom, hoping to escape, and they followed in mirrored steps, one always ahead, one always behind, forming a frame around me that left no safe angle. The masks caught glints of light in impossible ways, reflecting angles that shouldn't exist, multiplying their shapes into faint echoes along the walls as I tried to track them. I froze near the bed, realizing their mirrored positions now aligned exactly with my own. like the room itself had become a stage for their ritual observation. The faint sound of cloth brushing against floorboards accompanied their slight movements, synchronized perfectly with my heartbeat, as though my pulse was guiding their dance. I tried stepping backwards slowly, but each movement they anticipated, their mirrored limbs reaching impossibly to maintain symmetry, as if reality bent to preserve it. A sudden creak sounded behind me, though no one was there, and I realized the mirrored pair weren't alone. They were being mirrored themselves by something beyond my vision. The walls seemed to ripple slightly where they crouched, floors bending subtly, objects shifting minutely, a soft, mechanical hum filling the space I couldn't place. I raised my voice this time, demanding them to leave, and they tilted their heads in perfect unison. One small, slow step toward the bed, the other perfectly mirrored. The room darkened briefly, shadows pooling unnaturally, their mirrored forms blending into a single shifting mass, yet still distinct enough to know two figures observed me with ritual precision. When I finally tried to flee through the window, the reflection in the glass showed them on both sides, crouched in perfect symmetry, never breaking formation, waiting for the next movement. I realized then that leaving wasn't an option. A mirrored pair didn't follow to attack, but to observe, to learn, to record every detail. A silent ritual that bent reality around them. I sat down, chest tight, watching, understanding that this night wasn't an isolated event. The figures would always be there, mirrored, patient, and impossibly aligned with whatever I did next. The masked pairs living under my bed. I first heard scratching under my bed, faint but rhythmic, like someone tapping a secret code only I couldn't understand. When I leaned down to look, two small figures crouched in the shadows, wearing twisted animal masks, one rabbit, one deer, but their heads moved independently of their bodies. They weren't quite human. Their limbs bent at angles no human could manage, elbows pointing backward, knees folding like origami. When I froze, they mirrored me, copying my breathing, my slight shiver, down to the tilt of my head. One slid up the bedpost, hanging upside down, limbs crawling like they were made of liquid, staring at me with hollow mask eyes that glimmered faintly. I tried to leave, but they multiplied. Tiny versions of themselves appeared in the corners. The closet, even faint reflections in the mirror, crouched in perfect synchronization. They whispered in soft clicks, squeaks, and high-pitched tones I could feel rather than hear, like my skull was vibrating with their language. I saw one climb onto the ceiling, flattening impossibly, gliding above me like a shadow obeying gravity on its own rules. I moved backward, and the figures slid beneath the bed, then reappeared halfway up the walls, tilting unnaturally, faces still masked, still staring. One small hand reached out, not to touch, but to trace the outline of my shadow on the wall, bending it like clay. I screamed, and the figures stopped. For a moment, everything went silent, their mirrored heads tilted slightly, as if studying my reaction. Then the floorboards groaned. One figure emerged, but taller, limbs elongated grotesquely, crawling forward in a rhythm my eyes couldn't track. The bed shifted slightly, as if it had become liquid, molding itself around the figures so they could move under and over simultaneously. I tried shining a flashlight. The light bent strangely, shadows elongating in impossible directions. Figures crouched in those warped silhouettes, multiplying, tilting, moving against angles. I backed into the corner. One small rabbit-masked figure crawled across the wall, upside down, head swiveling unnaturally, watching me through hollow eyes. They began humming softly, a tone I could feel in my chest, vibrating in sync with my heartbeat, like they were imprinting themselves on my body. When I blinked, a dozen pairs of tiny deer-masked figures peeked from every corner, mirrored on ceiling and floor simultaneously, defying any spatial logic. One slid along the ceiling above me, landing behind the mirror. Its reflection moved first, then it followed, slightly delayed, mocking my fear. I tried crawling to the door, but the floor bent like fabric, rippling under me, the figures sliding seamlessly along every distorted surface. The whispers grew louder, clicking in high tones, forming patterns that made my brain tingle uncomfortably, like static mixed with laughter. I glanced under the bed, their little hands pressed against the floorboards, pressing upward as if trying to reshape the room from below. They started to move in unison, tilting, stretching, slithering, crawling, sliding along walls, floor, ceiling, a single fluid motion multiplied dozens of times. One figure climbed the wall, stretched upward unnaturally, then leapt through the ceiling, disappearing, only to reappear crouched under the dresser, staring at me through the mirror. I realized they were everywhere at once under the bed, above the ceiling, inside the walls, reflections of themselves appearing in every corner simultaneously. The masks began to warp subtly, the rabbit's ears curling backward, the deer's muzzle stretching thin, eyes glinting impossibly bright, still silent, still perfectly mirrored. I shook, backing into the wall. Their mirrored heads tilted in perfect synchronization, 1 inch apart, studying me, anticipating every micro-movement. I dared not breathe. The room itself seemed alive, floors pulsing, walls bending, shadows slithering, and every motion I made was mirrored before I even did it. They started tapping in sequence, rhythmically, on floor, walls, ceiling. Each tap synchronized with my heartbeat, building tension, echoing in every corner. I finally looked under the bed. The smallest ones crawled out in a wave, dozens, identical, all masked, all tilting, all sliding toward me silently. I stumbled backward. The floor twisted like liquid. The ceiling stretched upward. Every angle in the room bent toward the tiny intruders, bending physics, bending reality, bending me. I whispered their name. They froze. The room fell silent. I realized they were waiting, always waiting, for the moment I moved again. The masked figures hidden in every corner. The first sign was a faint tapping under my bed, irregular, like tiny fingers testing gravity in ways my ears couldn't measure. I crouched and saw them. Miniature masked figures, rabbit and fox, crouched perfectly still, watching, tilting their heads in unison with my movements. I blinked. There were more tiny versions of themselves, creeping along the edges of the room, scaling walls at impossible angles, sticking to ceilings like liquid shadows. I froze. They mirrored my breathing, pausing when I inhaled, tilting their heads, tiny mouths moving silently, as if practicing speech I couldn't understand. One crawled across the floor, limbs bending backward, joints folding impossibly, approaching a shoe on the carpet, tapping it lightly, testing its reaction. I tried leaving the room. The doorway stretched slightly, slanted impossibly, bending toward the figures, forcing me to step sideways to even reach the hall. The lamp flickered, shadows multiplied. I counted 3 masks in the corners, then 6, then 12 each crouched impossibly, each tilting, each watching, perfectly mirrored to my paranoia. I touched the bed frame. One tiny figure climbed along the leg, elongated its limbs, flattened like liquid, fingers reaching toward the mattress, tilting its head slowly, observing. The closet door opened by itself. Inside, dozens more masked figures crouched, stacked impossibly like origami dolls, all moving in perfect unison when I turned my head. I backed into the corner. The walls bent subtly, corners elongating, floors twisting, ceiling dipping, all shaping the room into angles that trapped me and highlighted their presence. One small figure slid along the ceiling, limbs bending in ways impossible for humans, landing on the dresser, tilting its head, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I tried shining my phone's flashlight. Shadows bent with it, flickering in impossible ways, figures sliding along the floor, ceiling, and walls simultaneously. I moved a chair. It moved back on its own, slowly, predictably, placing itself as though marking territory, herding me subtly toward the bed. The whispers began soft clicks and high-pitched tones I felt rather than heard, synchronizing with my heartbeat, vibrating in my skull, insistent, deliberate. I froze. A tiny fox-masked figure slid from under the bed, elongated, stretching into my shadow, tilting its head impossibly, examining my posture. I blinked. In the mirror, I saw versions of myself crouching like them, tiny, masked, tilting, moving in perfect synchronization, yet none of it was me. I backed into the wall. One figure crawled up the leg of the bed, across the ceiling, dropped onto the dresser, and tilted its head toward me again. I reached for the door. The floor warped slightly, angles bending, forcing me to step sideways. Figures slid along every surface in perfect anticipation of my movements. I whispered. They froze. Tiny silhouettes in the mirror paused, head tilting, body crouched, waiting silently for me to move again. I stepped toward the closet. The tiny figures multiplied dozens now, stacked on each other, sliding along walls, peering from corners, tilting their heads in unison. The ceiling bent slightly. One figure elongated impossibly, tilting, reaching toward a lamp, tapping it rhythmically, testing the sound it produced. I crouched under the bed briefly. Their tiny faces peeked down, tilting toward me, whispering in clicks that made my teeth ache. I rose. The walls pulsed faintly, shadows stretched. Figures climbed, slid, crouched, multiplied. Every corner had them, mirrored in reflections, crouched under furniture and watching. I stumbled toward the window. They mirrored me perfectly, sliding along sill, tilting head, stretching limbs in ways physics couldn't allow. The lamp flickered again. The reflection in the mirror showed figures where none existed. Some crouched in the corners of the room I could never see directly. I tried to breathe. The smallest ones crawled across the floor, scaled walls, slid along ceilings, all tilting, observing, whispering, perfectly synchronized with my movements. I froze. The room bent, corners elongated, floor twisted, ceiling dipped, shadows stretched, all to accommodate the presence of hundreds of tiny watchers. I dared not move. The figures crouched in perfect anticipation, mirrored in every surface, every reflection, every corner, waiting patiently for a misstep. The bed shifted slightly. One figure crawled onto it, limbs bending impossibly, head tilting, staring directly at me, watching, always watching. I realized there is no escaping. They are everywhere, inside every reflection, under every piece of furniture, on the ceiling, inside the walls, patient, learning, waiting.